The federal budget is less than 2 weeks away, and already the federal government is positioning itself to sell this year's document. Joining me now is Fairfax's chief political correspondent, Mark Kenny. Good morning, Mark.
G'day, Chris.
What are the lessons the government has learnt from last year as it prepares this year's budget?
Well, I guess we'll have to wait and see when we see the document, but judging by the difference between the sort of pre-budget periods of the 2 years, it does seem that there's a marked difference in the way it's going about its storytelling this time around. Now, of course, there have been some big stories around. You know, we've had the appalling earthquake in Nepal this week. We've had the Bali 9, the executions of those two unfortunate gentlemen for a start. So in recent times there's been a lot of focus on things that are away from the budget, but that's really suited the government, I think, quite well. Tony Abbott said some time ago that this was going to be a dull and routine budget. That was itself a reflection of the lessons they learnt from last year's colossal miscalculations. So really it's all, the government's approach, it seems, has all been about really not drawing too much attention to the budget. We've had fewer stories leaked or seeded into the media by the government about the budget this time around than has happened in probably the last 4 or 5 years. So it's been a much quieter period, and presumably that presages a much quieter budget in a sense, and that's what the government hopes to do.
Yeah, there is this sort of, I think, impression that there will be a concentration on families, on childcare. What do we know there?
Well, again, this is part of the difference as well. Last year it was all about cuts, all about sacrifice, all about pain. This year it's supposedly all about protecting households, shielding households from the hard work. Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey have been saying that most of the hard work has been done in terms of budget repair, and we learned a while ago really from Tony Abbott that in fact the budget would be putting money into the pockets of households to some extent, and that would be through this childcare package. Now, there are slowly some details coming into the public realm about this childcare package. We don't exactly know the details, but we do know some of the principles. One of them is that it's going to be about increasing workforce participation, and that's how the government's going to sort of justify this expenditure. And there's also small business tax cuts as well.
It sounds as if on the childcare front there will be some more money for one group of people who are working, but tighter activity tests for those who aren't working. Is it, I guess, as a way to make sure that any new measures don't cost the bottom line too much?
Well, there's certainly a report about that today, but I understand that Scott Morrison, the Social Services Minister, has been dismissing that aspect of the coverage. So it remains to be seen, you know, how much truth there is in those reports.
I think that's based on a Productivity Commission report recommendations, and perhaps people are confused between what the Commission has recommended and how much of that the government has actually accepted.
Yes, you never want to make that link too concrete, because the truth is governments reject these recommendations all the time.
Nevertheless, though, the government really can't afford to be too generous, because hanging over its head, as indicated this week by the investment bank Goldman Sachs, that Australia's AAA credit rating may be at risk if there isn't a credible path back to surplus set out. Maybe not this year, not next year, but at some time in the future that the books will be restored to balance.
Yeah, that's right, and this is something the government's kind of been, delicately trying to handle as well, because it needs to keep that narrative going that savings need to be made, that tough decisions need to be made, that revenue and expenditure need to be brought back into balance. But at the same time, it's engaged at the moment in a much more short-term existential imperative, and that is its own survival. You know, political survival has taken precedence over sort of longer-term economic survival, presumably, and we'll see how the government manages to balance that this time around.
Last year's budget was something of a political disaster for the government, and one of the reasons for that, as indicated by opinion polls and even comments by people like the former Prime Minister John Howard, was this fairness test. How important do you think, how much emphasis will the government be placing on the perceptions that this year's budget, that the pain and the gain is fairly spread?
Well, pretty much everything is going to be about trying to sell that. It's really quite interesting that in the days and weeks after the budget last year, the government's first budget, the Labor opposition was using and really hammering this term fairness all the time and saying that the budget had been unfair. Now, it may have sounded hollow at first, it may have even sounded, a fairly subjective comment, but it actually did register with people, and it turned out to be probably the dominant outtake of the budget for most voters. So much so that Labor's focus group research was showing up the term budget itself as a negative. People were equating it with unfairness. So the government rejected that all through last year, and yet has now really tacitly admitted that was the case with the declarations, a number of them now we've seen from both the Treasurer and the Prime Minister, that this budget will be about doing things, but doing them with fairness in mind. So, it's pretty much an admission that that commentary last year was correct.
One thing I find fascinating is the personnel involved. Usually the budget is almost entirely built around the Treasurer, Joe Hockey in this case. Often then the Prime Minister comes in, or more or less in a supporting role after the budget's been delivered. But this year we're seeing, say, Scott Morrison playing a more prominent role in the run-up to the budget. What do you read into that?
Well, I guess it has a lot to do with the area that Scott Morrison has, social security, and the issues we've just been talking about, particularly in respect of pensions and childcare assistance and these sorts of things, money for families. These are often in the social security portfolio. But it's also fairly clear that Joe Hockey is something of a diminished character politically. His authority has been severely dented by last year's budget, and by the fairly poor sales job of that budget, the poor design of it to begin with. A lot of the primary decisions were just wrong politically. They weren't even economically that sound, and we've seen that the government's just had a lot of trouble getting any progress through the Senate. That's not entirely the government's fault, of course, but even the negotiation with the Senate has been fairly inept, and Joe Hockey's role in that has hardly changed anything. So now we see a situation where other people are starting to sort of do the heavy lifting of communicating the government's position. And Scott Morrison, who was, of course, regarded as a hard man when he was in the border protection portfolio, immigration and border protection, very much a hard man, very uncompromising, very tough. He has emerged as the sort of human face of the government. It's quite a remarkable turnaround. Morrison is a very good interlocutor. He's a very good explainer. He's a formidable sort of, I think, debater of issues. He doesn't brook fools, and he manages to put the government's message very forcefully. So it will be interesting to see how this responsibility for selling these policies by Morrison, how well this works. But it seems that that's the way the government's leaning.
Okay, Mark Kenny, thanks for your insights today.
Thanks, Chris.